And away we go. Okay, good. Turn off this very distracting captioning. Okay, good. Welcome, everybody, to week 5. The others will join us as we go through, I'm sure. This is our second last week together. And for those who are doing the group work, tomorrow will be our last group work session. And for everybody else who's working on the Padlets, the majority of you have kind of gravitated towards the Padlets. Please go and have a look at the feedback that's coming from myself and Jose to you. But also, I highly recommend that everybody else goes and pays a visit to the Padlet page and takes a look through some of the examples, because now you're starting to see the process and becoming more visual across a number of very interesting cases. And so if you've got any ideas that you would like to share with any of the other participants, please do it. It'll only take a minute of your time, and it's quite interesting. Most of us will have worked in different contexts or in some of the contexts that other people are currently grappling with now. So share your experiences. And to be honest, that's what we're going to do today. We're going to talk more with you than on any other session to date. So let's see how that goes. But first, as always, let me do my magical Miro board so we can situate ourselves. And here it is. You can see that, right? Yes?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, great. Okay, so we have set our objectives based on an analysis. We have identified our stakeholders. We have really looked into what are their motivations, what's the power, what's the influence that they have. We have then chosen our tactics: public confrontational, private confrontational, public positive, private positive, denunciation, persuasion, mobilization, capacity building. We've looked at all of those. And finally, we've come to designing our message, right? What is it that we want to say now that we know who we're saying it to? But most importantly, we're knowing what it is that will motivate or is motivating them. And then we've looked a bit at the engagement, which is this week to some extent. How do we take forward all of the decisions that we've made? How do we continue to collaborate? We've looked at the roles of our partners and our allies. But the focus for today will really be going to challenges and risk management for our online session. But why do I keep doing this to you, me and Jose, every week? Because the strength of advocacy and our ability to have confidence is to stick to the process. The process is the thing. And the reason why we left the messages until quite late in the process is because the natural tendency is to jump straight through HCT messages or agency-specific messages without having gone through this this real in-depth look at what is actually going on and what it is it that we want to change, and then who, and then how. And if we skimp on those steps, if we take shortcuts, we miss out. And I'm just going to run you through very quickly what the group have been doing. And they've been working on climate-related displacement. They did their analysis. They keep coming back and adding in new sections to the analysis. They're focusing on Somalia because it's been hit by floods. And Josephine very kindly added to this with another analysis on education. But then there's specific objectives that are looking at the short and the long term. And then we moved to the power to influence and the level of interest. And we've got all of these different stakeholders identified. But as we go through the process and we look at our public confrontational, our public positive, our various tactics, and of course, most advocacy starts here in this private, positive, bilateral meetings where people are sharing their messages with the stakeholders. And if we're doing this correctly, if I represent one organization, you represent another, we're all coming with a similar or very, very, or even better, the same message to that one stakeholder. And then we're moving into public positive. But as we go through this, we're looking at, oh, actually, did we think about this person? And we're jumping back to look at our engagement again. And of course, with any campaign, we're always trying to take these guys who might be here and slowly move them in here with our tactics. So we're constantly carving out the time within our coalitions or within our own teams to go back and relook at the analysis. As you know, whoops, the context is changing all the time. And our stakeholders, the people who are causing the issues that we would like to see changed, are going to be constantly shifting the goalposts. And another thing that comes out of the constant debate that we will have, of course, is the risks, right? And for the groups here, as they're going through, should we do off the record meetings? Should we do initial consultations? Should we share the evidence with the donors? The risks are coming up from the debate. We might have bilateral meetings, might create division between ministries. So which ministry should we be targeting first? Let's now go back to our stakeholder analysis and see, have we targeted the right ministries? So this debate, this constant flux is what you need to be cultivating to get to the kind of impact that you want to see on the ground. They also had the risk of meetings leading to nothing, which is a very, very pertinent one and should always be on our radar, is so what at the end of each meeting. Now, as we go through today's session, we'll show you some of the tools that you can use to mitigate risks, but also to make sure that you have some progress in what you're doing. And then they moved to their key message, and they had an issue statement. They provided some evidence, and then they had some very clear asks. We want the Ministry of Education to reduce missed school days by this much percentage for children at risk. Do we have this evidence? Not right now. Let's go back and find it. And they went and they found it. And then they asked for a campaign to raise parental awareness on the importance of education and its protective role, to be led by the MOE. I won't go into all of those, but from that, we have our messages. The next step is, who is the right person to lead this message or to take it forward with the MOE in this case? And rather than simply say, well, UNICEF is the best candidate, the participants said, well, it should be the education cluster. And why? Because they'd identified that there's a risk that one agency will take their mandate and just simply push their agenda towards the MOE. We're not saying anything against UNICEF here. I'm just using it as an example. The group work here is mostly a half hypothetical, half theoretical example. But as you go through the debate, ideally with a number of organizations, you're going to come across these issues and you're going to get sharper and sharper as you get to the actual point where you're bringing your message to the stakeholder. And then today we're going to look at risks, right? How to manage risks. And we've already in the group identified them. And as you've gone through your process on the Padlet by having completed the previous steps. Now at that, I'm going to stop sharing. And Jose, is there anything you want to add before I throw out a couple of questions to people?
Yes, I think we should look at risk substantively, and we should think both of the risks of our strategy and the actions linked to our strategy, and the risks that we may create for the persons of concern. And then there are other elements of risks that are your own personal risk within your organization, no? Because we've all been in the situation where you think, okay, if I raise this, or if I come up with these opinions or ideas, this may put myself at risk within my own hierarchical structure, no? So there are risks for you as an advocate, there are risks for the organization, and then there are risks that are related to the global sphere, no? So globally, how is this going to influence or to have an impact on similar situations? Over to you, Matt.
Okay, thanks, Jose. So the topic of this week is how do we examine this trade-off between principled risks and pragmatic approaches? How do we look at mitigating the risks that we face? But again, probably the number one challenge, and there's a difference between challenge and risks, is the challenge of actually saying something as opposed to being put in a position where you believe it is safer to say or do nothing. And back at the very start of the course, one of the first questions we asked is what is the impact of doing nothing or saying nothing? And this is really where we want to get to with this session. And if you remember back to the interview that we conducted with Gemma Davies from ODI, she said that in her findings on collective advocacy, that the humanitarian sector adopts a very risk-averse approach at the leadership and at the field levels, which at times is overstated. So how do we get from a perception that the risk might be too high to actually say or do something to a much more evidence-based analysis and approach? And again, this is why we always go through step 1, step 2, step 3. If we stick to the structure of advocacy, the process that we have, and we're jumping back and forward consistently, our understanding is going to get more and more sophisticated as we go along. But also as well, we really want to understand who it is we want to talk to and what are the motivations that are going to give them something that is also of interest to them. Now, the Global Protection Cluster, in their handbook, they said that the risks should not prevent advocacy, but they should be driving us as humanitarian actors and the broader coalition, who are not necessarily humanitarian actors, to work together. And of course, within our own organizations, we do also have to understand what's our organizational position, what are the risks that we face as an organization if we're going to take a very principled and pragmatic approach, let's say vis-a-vis conflict actors or a hostile state actor. And that will help us understand how our own organization can perceive risks. But we should be working in a coalition in order to be more effective. And we'll go through some of those details now. But Walters, I see your hand is up. Let me throw out a question as well after, and then I'll open the floor to you, Walters. The first thing I wanted to ask, is there anybody who wants to talk about a particular challenging issue that they have right now related to advocacy or a risk they perceive that they would like to raise as an example? And floor is yours, Walter.
Yeah, perhaps. Thank you so much. I find this discussion very, very interesting. And there are times an organization, in order not to not say anything and decides to, it could be the head of mission or the ROC decides to make a statement because it was judged at the time to be so important, and this may lead to expulsion. But if the organizational position is that it was so important to say that, and perhaps it's important to sacrifice the position of that individual, because after all, he will be replaced or she will be replaced by another person who may continue with the same. And that's a way of sending the message, perhaps to the host authorities, that this is the position of the organization. It's not going to change regardless. But what I seem to see in countries where this has happened is that all the organization become too risk averse. And so should the individual organization look at this position and say, on our side is the right thing to do, but at the same time, look at the ripple effects it creates amongst other international partners whose advocacy is also important in achieving that specific goal. It's just something I see on the ground in a number of countries, and I just wanted to put it out there. That dilemma, how do you overcome that?
Excellent. Thank you, Walters. Jose, hold your mind there. Oh, no, you put your hand down. Jamie.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Thanks, Matt. And I think just piggyback a little bit on Walter's commentaries.
Mm-hmm.
And this has to do with the person. focal point of advocacy. So I understand there are situations when if a particular topic of advocacy is so sensitive, then other persons can be selected from within organizations to make that statement. So for example, it need not necessarily be for the resident coordinator in a country to speak to significant human rights violations, for example, that the government is perpetrating. Some other person within a hierarchy in New York may decide to insulate the RC in that instance and then make that statement on behalf of the United Nations. So I was wondering whether in a broader advocacy planning, sometimes do we map out alternative persons who can pitch in difficult situations? So do we say, this is such a sensitive issue, it's very thorny, we have to draw a line as an organization publicly on this position, but to insulate our principles on the ground, perhaps somebody at HQ should do it. And so that's just what I wanted to put out there.
Okay, yeah, thank you, Jamie. Does anybody else want to contribute questions, particularly around this one of expulsion, because it comes up quite a lot, being PNG'd, or the impact that it may have on an organization's ability? Jamie, your hand is still up, or is that?
No, that's legacy hand.
Legacy hand. Okay, Francesco, go ahead.
Yes, hello everyone. I think that an element I was thinking about, particularly recently, where it has become very easy to, to kick out people. I mean, the last piece of information came a few days ago and has been confirmed today about the humanitarian coordinator in Jerusalem, right? Is, when we assess risk, which risk we really assess, right? And for me, the risk of a person who can be kicked out is a secondary risk. I mean, the risk has to do with the people we want to protect, and the process and the message itself, how that, the risks around how the message would be perceived or landed in the ears of the multiple audiences we are seeking. Because, eventually the impact and the risk for the individual who advocates, unless it's a physical risk, it's a risk that is part of the job, right? While my sense is that part of the inhibiting factors has a lot to do with the impact on the individual or the individuals who advocate, which to me comes secondary to the beneficiaries and to the ecosystem that we would like the advocacy to influence, right? So sometimes it's a matter also where institutions and people are putting the attention on the impact of the advocacy. And also, of course, this comes from the experience that the system then will have to naturally sacrifice the individual or the individuals for the sake of the institutional effort or the partner's effort to be pursued by somebody else. But so I think that there is also some, there is some reflection at, at the protection partners level in terms of the effectiveness and the risk management around our advocacy, our protection goals, versus the individual assessing his or her own risks together with other partners, as it has been done in the past by humanitarian country teams, on how they are going to handle that impact on themselves as individuals eventually. Over.
Thank you, Francesco. Jose, did you want to add something?
Yes, I mean, I think we are talking at the end about the fine line or the equilibrium between self-censorship or that is, exaggerated risk-averse approaches, or advocacy approaches that are actually counterproductive. And we have many examples on both possibilities, but in the case of Myanmar is an interesting one to look at, because there were a few years in Myanmar where the UN was, let's say, self-censoring on criticizing human rights challenges by the authorities, in the thought that in the long run the transition will lead to better democracy, development, human rights protection, etc. And it has turned out to be the opposite. So there's you have the Rosenthal report in the chat box that you can read if you are interested. But that was a case of, self-censorship by UN that was then criticized. And now, after the coup in Myanmar, we have again this, this dilemma between who makes the outspoken advocacy and in which context. And we have on one side the special rapporteur on human rights in Myanmar making loud statements, and in Myanmar, the UN being very, very cautious. So over to Eze. Chukwuemeka Eze.
Thank you very much. I think I quite agree with a couple of interventions that colleagues have made, but perhaps if we begin to look at risk as not just the threats, but also plus vulnerability, then it would help in making a decision. So while the threat exists, what is the vulnerability of both the RC and also other colleagues to that particular threat over the statement that has been issued? I think that will also provide the impetus and the rationale for making such a decision. I just wanted to add that.
Excellent, thank you. Thanks, Chukwu. And just on that one, I mean, within your own organization and for Francesco and Walters who have started, I mean, in terms of making those decisions right now, how do you currently go about assessing risks?
Okay, so in my own case, the first thing I will do is to seek for detailed information from the national office. We operate 15 national offices. Okay, so I'll seek the detailed information from the national office, most likely from the National Network Coordinator. Following this kind of guidance that I've provided, what are the existing threats and how vulnerable are you or the rest of the staff to such statements that have been issued? So in the past, we have had instances where we have had a different opinion from the state with regards to maybe the conduct of an election. Okay, so once we made those assessments and also checked with other stakeholders with regards to what they think, then we'll make a decision whether to evacuate or also now escalate it to the point where institutions and partners and stakeholders like ECOWAS and African Union will provide the kind of intervention that we think. If it also means that at the end of the day, that we feel that issues may have been resolved, but probably the national coordinator or whoever made that statement is still vulnerable to that threat, then we will gradually now find a way to relocate or reassign the person.
Excellent. Okay, thanks. Walters, I see you want to say something?
Yeah, just very briefly, that in the context I was referring to, I think face-to-face advocacy, direct kind of private personal advocacy is the best. I mean, we've just moved away from any sort of public advocacy, issuing of statement or press conferences, because that will be counterproductive, and it presents numerous risks, not only for the organization, but also for those you are trying to protect.
Thanks. Yes, the bilateral advocacy is usually the most effective in practice. Yeah, thanks, Walters. Jamie, your hand is up again. Go for it.
Yeah, so just to quickly share this. So I was just thinking, over at Global Affairs Canada, what we tend to do often is, if the risks is significant and of such a character that we feel it would impede the ambassadors' capacity to continue to access the government and influence policy on the ground, we take it on at the HQ level. So I had to ask ambassadors, for example, not to engage in certain issues. Now, when we feel that a particular point of advocacy is so significant that it may allow the particular Canadian government to be singled out, we work alongside like-minded. So like-minded are basically friendly nations who have very, very similar policy postures with us. The Americans, the Brits, we sit with them and say, this is a significant issue. can we issue joint statements? And so you realize that the Canadians are coming out with a statement, the Americans are following up with that statement, and the Danes are following up with a statement, and the Swedes are following up with a statement. That way, it neutralizes, the host government from picking up on one country. So I was wondering whether, and sometimes we do that also in support of UN partners on the ground. We do that if it's an issue that has to do with human rights violations, that has to do with, conduct of elections. I know that we've had to calibrate our posture in support of resident coordinators or UN officials on the ground just to provide that kind of insulation. So that's also one strategy that can be used in very delicate situations like this.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Jamie. Yeah, that's ideal, and that's coming from the diplomatic state level perspective, where you're pulling in allies who are other member states, and then effectively you're splitting the same message, but then it's coming at your key stakeholders from a number of angles. Is there anybody else who hasn't spoken yet who wants to talk about a particular? I'd be very interested to hear a specific challenge that they're currently facing, and then we'll look at some of the strategies. You've already actually mentioned some of the key things. Yes, Adham, go ahead. You're muted. You're muted.
Yeah, my topic was about the expected returnees and the return of the IDPs from Gaza ongoing war, and thinking about and everything that I heard, there are definitely some challenges which maybe could be grouped into, for example, the human rights challenge, which is the solution that we're offering, that all the entitlements of the IDPs and their place and the rights to the security, housing, education, and others could be compromised through and could not be achieved. That's a possible risk. That after returning to their places of residence, they find out that there was no education, housing, but this can be mitigated through proper measures taken properly before. Also, another humanitarian challenge can be of an issue here, because obviously some of them upon the return will need some sort of funding and houses built again, things like that. Also, there is a peace challenge, which I think is the most critical. And for me, this is a red one, that before initiating this whole project, there has to be a long-term ceasefire treaty signed between all parties, so that all our efforts when started is not does not collapse upon the ensue of fire again. So these are some of the things I came up with during the discussions. Over to you.
Thanks, Adham. Yes, so that's quite important as well, that you're splitting out the various rights to one extent that need to be addressed, but also as well, you're ensuring this long-term perspective. And this is where I think is a particular challenge, as Francesco was mentioning, for those of you who are going to be someday seated as a humanitarian coordinator, where you will have to balance the resident coordinator, longer-term development perspectives with the shorter term, to be honest, and much more pressing issues that will be presented to you by the humanitarian actors. Now, just as a couple of quick things on what you've said so far, I think Francesco actually highlighted one of the main issues, which is what's the change that we want to see on the ground. And the impact when it comes to protection is always, we want to see the safety, security, dignity of the people that we're assisting improved. We want to see the risk of violence, coercion, and deprivation reduced. And then often when we start to talk about the challenges to advocacy or the risks, the first questions or the risks that get raised most quickly are either expulsion from the country, or the second one will be denial of access to territory, as Jose has mentioned. Now, in practice, there's probably a number of high-profile expulsions that will have happened, but they're not the majority of the let's say the consequences of us conducting protection advocacy. In the main, there will have been, and there is again with the HC in Jerusalem, a small number of people or organizations that have been temporarily removed from a context by a state. But at the end of the day, one of the questions to factor into your analysis is, what is the benefit to that state to having humanitarian organizations there? And there is a benefit. There's usually going to be some legitimacy offered by our presence, or the fact that we're funding, or the fact that there's opportunities for partnership. So it's one aspect there when we start discussing this topic around expulsions. The main point is, if you are taken out of the game, let's say, will the population on the ground lose access to the services? Most likely that vacuum will be filled by the broad horizon of NGOs, civil society, and other UN agencies that are all that are still in the country. So that needs to be factored into the analysis as well. Will this have a dramatic impact on the population on the ground or not? And I think, Francesco, you've said it very well, that sometimes it might seem like one agency falls on the sword, and it's happened to MSF in Myanmar, I think, as well, right, Jose? In 2014, they were out for 6 months, and then they're back in again. And it happened to NRC in Ethiopia, but they're back in again. So the ultimate question below is, what is the impact in terms of assistance, and will the people who we're trying to provide assistance to lose that assistance? Most often, the action will not actually impact that much on the assistance. Correct me if I'm wrong. I'm happy to debate this one with everybody. But what happens is, the trend then is, if the impact is going to be on my career or on my organization's ability to continue working, that the tendency is to say and do nothing. And this is where we want to shift the needle a little bit. And I think Walters has said it as well, that most effective advocacy is actually happening bilaterally, but with a broad coalition of actors working together, so that messaging is continuing to happen. And then, Jose, I know you have your hand up. The last thing I will say before passing back to Jose is the other question that you have raised: who is the most appropriate messenger for the message? We've seen in week 2 that it could be a military actor will have a more credible stance with a non-state armed group, with a commander or with the leader of law enforcement, than necessarily we might have. Or, and one of the things that I find a little bit challenging in the humanitarian sector is we're not investing enough time. And maybe, if for those of you who were participating in the IHL session we did, and thanks again to Kashka for setting that up, a lot of the key learning for me behind that was, have we invested in building the relationships with those kind of groups? Have we got some connections, either secondhand or direct, with a non-state armed group that's operating where we're operating? Do we have the connections with law enforcement? Do we have the connections built up with the local authorities? And do we have the connections built up with the armed forces of the state? And quite often we don't. And when everything goes south in terms of protection violations, we're trying to build those relationships from scratch. I'll stop there, and I'll come back with a couple of other points in a second. Jose, over to you.
Yeah, I'll just mention very concrete examples. No, so for example, in the case of Myanmar, you had a quasi-apartheid regime in Rakhine State against the Rohingya minority, and many international aid agencies or organizations, they were making a very unbalanced choice. No, is I will not criticize the authorities so that I can have my school refurbishment project in Rakhine, and therefore I have a presence, no? Or I can maintain my, I don't know, road rehabilitation, cash for work program happily there, no? So then the question is it worth it? You know, do you think the human rights violations that this group are suffering are worth, your silence is worth, you know, a little project about painting the walls of a school, no? So it depends, you know, it's very different if your project is life-saving support, like, for example, providing food assistance in a situation of malnutrition, or it's something else. So that all comes into the balance. And I think we another example is assessing the likelihood of the potential threat, no? Because, for example, in Myanmar, while working with NRC, we quickly realized that the authorities did not care so much about what we say in, for example, English media publications that were distributed between international organizations, reports, etc. That was really not so important as you would have believed initially, no? So the degree of self-censorship has to also be based on some evidence, no? To assess, okay, what is really going to trigger losing access or one of us being expelled from this country, no? And usually these are, you know, these are very concrete triggers that are not just one, you know, random message here or one report that has been published. So we have to, as Matt said, think of what the stakeholder is interested about us. You know, what is the benefit of our presence to this government authority or to this military authority? And sometimes that is carries a much stronger weight than whether we are talking in a conference about child protection or talking to media, etc., etc. Over to you, Matt.
Okay, let me show you oh, what is this? This looks weird. And okay, I'm going to steal this tool from Crisis Action. Now, we have a video in our resources section of an interview that we did with Nicola Reindorp, who is the CEO of Crisis Action. It's about half an hour long. I recommend you watch the first maybe 15 minutes if you have time. It's an optional extra. But I do want to show you how Crisis Action assess what might be going wrong with a campaign and how they can adjust, because this is where some of the risks can be addressed, and this is how they take it forward. The other thing I would say about the Crisis Action model, if you're not familiar with them, is that they work entirely behind the scenes. They're a dedicated coordinator on campaigns about the protection of civilians. So you won't see a Crisis Action-led campaign. They also operate a model where it's opt-in. So if there's a campaign on a particular issue in a particular country, they will not just open the doors to every organization who wants to be part of this topic. They will only open the doors to organizations that have a genuine interest. And the reason why they're doing that is because if you try and then keep every organization happy, you will have lowest common denominator decisions taken. You're looking for consensus as opposed to a focus on impact, on that change that you want to see happening on the ground. So they have an opt-in model. And then the third aspect of what they do is that it's partner-led. So this goes a bit to your question, Jamie. It's partner approved, not partner-led campaigning, which means that if you're part of the campaign and you're a human rights actor, you're in a much stronger position to speak up around violations by virtue of the work that you do. Whereas if you're a humanitarian actor and you're concerned about maintaining your access in an area where you're currently operating, then you can approve the messaging that might go forward, but you're not exactly going to take that message forward yourself. You are going to let other aspects of the coalition, other actors, take the messaging forward. So a bit like Jamie was mentioning, there may be a state or a coalition of state allies that are in a much better position by virtue of the development funding they're bringing into to a country, or they have specific vested interests in industry, or potentially arms deals that are going ahead, or whatever, that will have a much stronger impact on the stakeholder than the humanitarians than we may have from our position. In which case, knowing that they're there and what they're willing to take forward allows you to approve the decision, but not necessarily have to lead it. So that's how they work. It's a behind the scenes model. Now, when they're looking at risks and issues, they ask these 5 questions to their campaign and to their allies as they go forward. So if you do not see a change happening on the ground, the first answer they will give you is probably your solution is the wrong solution. And you'll know it's the wrong solution because the government or the armed group or whoever you're engaging with will tell you, we've tried this before, or this has happened 10 years ago and it didn't work then and it's not going to work now. In which case you're right back to the start, you're back to your analysis. What is it that we need to look at? What is our research? What can we bring in from other contexts? And that's the second part. Maybe the system doesn't know that the change or the solution that you're proposing is the right one, or they're not aware of it, in which case we're lobbying. And this is where that broad coalition of actors who are coming together with the same messaging, but are most likely doing it in a number of series of bilateral meetings between their organization and the stakeholder that you want to see. You're lobbying for that system. And here is where you can bring in examples of best practice from other countries or evidence from other contexts where it has worked. Or in our situation, where I worked in Jordan, where we were setting up Zachary Camp, and we realized that if we want to move away from the camp model, we want to move towards a system of governance that's more representative of the needs of people on the ground as simply than beneficiaries of humanitarian assistance. You start to bring in not more humanitarian actors, but you bring in the mayor of, let's say, Amsterdam to come in and talk about sanitation, with the local authorities in Nafrak to talk about the challenges, and then see what can be taken forward. We also had, if I stick with that example, challenges with safety and security, where the law enforcement had been attacked by the residents of the camp on a number of occasions and had resorted to actually staying outside of the camp with a deterioration in security. And you can see the same thing happening now in Bangladesh, where Rohingya gangs are starting to take an excessive control of the law enforcement situation to the detriment of the safety and security of people in the camps. What do you do there? You bring in experts in community policing from other contexts, and you show them how this has worked, and you bring in that aspect of capacity building. Now, the third challenge there is there's no political reward. If you're trying to influence a politician, what motivates politicians? It's usually re-election or legitimacy or something that they can show that they've brought benefits to. If it's an armed actor, it's a commander, you're looking at, again, legitimacy. You're looking at them being able to control a particular territory or have a better standing within the community where they're trying to operate. There's some area of mutual interest, but if there's no political reward or you haven't identified it, you're going to face a risk of pushback from that particular actor, just as you have mentioned. And then here's the kind of the number 4 is the particularly, I would say, common one, which is the countervailing vested interests. So we have our interest in pushing for humanitarian access, or we want to provide assistance, but there are other actors out there who have no interest in humanitarian assistance, or who have business interests. And as you know, anybody who's advocating or working or now starting to engage in the climate and climate change and environmental will know exactly what kind of vested interests can affect the ongoing advocacy work where you're trying to get people's rights recognized. Big oil and fracking and all of those kind of multinational corporations are the countervailing vested interests. What do? You expose what's happening. This will not necessarily work for us as humanitarians, but it is good if we have that coalition developed with a broad range of actors who can take on those countervailing vested interests. And finally, I think is the competition is too big. We have a lot of organizations, a lot of NGOs, a lot of civil society actors who will all have their opinions on a particular issue and may be approaching it differently. And in which case you open up the risk for divide and conquer by the stakeholders or the actors whose behavior we wish to change. So if my small CSO is giving this message, your international NGO is giving a separate message, and I see an opportunity to split you down the middle and have you fight amongst yourselves, that way your campaign is going nowhere as well, or your advocacy efforts. So again, it's back to how do we form these alliances? How do we come to a common agreement on key messages? And again, think back to crisis actions model, which is not everybody should be in this campaign. So you opt in to be part of it. You don't just invite everybody and their mother to join you. Okay, I'll keep going. I'm going to stop sharing this and I'm going to show you a couple of tools, if that's okay. Let me know if you can see them. Yes, you can see this. Jose, I can see your face. Yeah, and you're nodding. Okay, fine. So how do organizations then go about managing risk, right? And risk is the effect of uncertainty on our operations. So what the Global Protection Cluster have, and I think they have quite a good number of tools available. The first one is the PESTLE tool, the political, economic, social, technological, legal, and environmental analysis of a context. And if you have listened to the video with Andreas Indegard, who had worked in Rakhine as for the UN, and he's a political negotiator and mediator, or this week's video as well with the Swiss mediator, they're going to tell you, if you're going into a difficult negotiation, the first thing you have to be is fully confident that you know the context that you're working in. Now, humanitarians, not great at this kind of level of analysis, but that doesn't mean that we have to do it. Your development partners, UNDP, peace building actors, human rights organizations, they will have this analysis to some extent done. And if you're building relationships with them, you can start to delve into the evidence that they have. But this will help, I think, with your credibility when you are going into difficult meetings against a potentially hostile interlocutor. And it's one of the main questions that we'll come to now is, okay, if we take the risk that we can bring this message to a stakeholder and we're going to take it directly, if we judge that the security is or the risk to our security or our staff security is tolerable, then we can take it forward. This is when all of these kind of tips come in. It may be that you find that the risk to you or to the community is too high, in which case you should definitely not do it. Oxfam have this very quick and simple tool that they use, which is what's the activity, what's the benefit to the community, which is what Francesco was pointing out. This is where we're really focusing. What's the risk to the community, our partners, how might they be mitigated, and what are the actions? And always we want to know who and when is going to do it. The other system is the traffic light system, where again, we start with our questions. Who are the stakeholders that are going to be affected? Who can influence the decisions? We're again always building on our analysis, and we're looking at the type of risks. Are they high? Are they medium? Are they low? Are they going to impact us? And if you want to play around with I'll just skip down here for a second, our Mira board, the examples of impact are all spelled out here, right? Insignificant, for example, no changes in safety and security, extreme, violent demonstrations causing offices to close, hibernate. These are the kind of things we need to be analyzing when we get to this stage. And then we go back up here. Sorry for making everybody dizzy. As you've gone through your analysis, you're starting to make your decisions. The opportunities outweigh the risks. We're not seen, which are not seen as significant. We're going to go forward, but we're going to monitor carefully. If we're not sure, we should be doing more analysis and investigation with our allies. And here we're calling it off. It's not for us. And I think one of the things that would be useful as you get to the task for this week, which is what are the risks that you've identified on the topic that you're working on right now, is does that mean, do I need to go back and change my tactics? Or is it that I need to now look at another stakeholder to take the message or ally forward? And the most useful tool that I've tended to use at work and or in the field has been very simple table like this. What's what's going to have the most impact on the work that we're doing, what's going to have the least, and mitigation. But again, identifying who is going to take the measure forward on the one hand, but the other big question is who is the messenger that is going to take any of these action forwards. And when I say messenger, I don't necessarily just mean we are very concerned by X. It's exactly what Jamie and Walters were talking about, those bilateral meetings where you're going in. Are you going in well prepared? Is it the right level of seniority that is meeting? Have we built up this relationship in the past? If not, is there somebody better placed to do it? So with that, I'm going to stop sharing. Is there any other comments from you, Jose? Or anything that I might
I mean, I think I will say that very important the security risks, because and especially security risk to concerned populations. If you look at module 5, there is a list of things that can happen as a result of advocacy, losing access, expulsions, closure of programs. But obviously, security should be number one. No? And this is a problem that we have, for example, now in Myanmar, no? With civil society organizations that are providing legal aid or other services. The risks they face are enormous, no? So you have to be very careful in also making sure that you don't expose any national actor to being detained, to being imprisoned or worse, and also to make sure that there is a risk sharing policy, right? That you don't, let's say, outsource the risks to your national partners. So there has to be a degree of fairness on how much risk your international agency takes and how much risks the national partners take, and then there is a bit of a paradox that the more risks that a situation creates, sometimes it leads to more localization, no? Because the international actors do not want to face those risks. So just a reflection on protecting national partners.
Is there any other comments or questions or observations or anything you feel that we haven't touched in this session? This one we've tried to be a little bit provocative in terms of shifting from risk aversion to risk tolerance, and I think from the comments that you have made already, I think there's an appetite for that. We're not saying completely go and take all sorts of risks. It's just there's a structure and there's a process behind it that will allow us to make more informed decisions, which is what we're trying to emphasize throughout this course. Is there any comments from anybody or something that we may have missed that you might want to raise?
I would have a short comment and a question, Matt, if that's okay.
Yes, go ahead, Kashka.
You mentioned the importance of political players, and also you mentioned the video on mediation. Now, I know that most of us think of ourselves as apolitical, but I would like to maybe caution about not having any contact with political players. And I'm saying that because there will be situations that happened to me when the issues at hand were so sensitive, so discreet, so confidential that absolutely no public advocacy was possible, no meetings were possible on the subject, never mind minutes of meetings and any public sausages. I'm thinking of a situation I had in Syria with the repatriations of the foreign fighters' children. This situation still exists. There's very little public discourse about it because our donors and the donors who fund our organizations are just completely allergic to having anything in the public domain about it. So anything that's going on, any small successes of repatriating children is due to very intense but very private and very discreet diplomacy, bilateral diplomacy, so directly with the services of the country that the children needed to be repatriated to. So that's my one point. Let's not underestimate contacts with parliamentarians, with politicians who can influence these things directly. And I know that's not something that we do. Part two of that question is the value of mediation. In most cases, as we know, it's happening in Gaza and everywhere else probably, that somebody will be mediating an issue or a conflict. And we are not often informed because, again, mediation is a very discreet and confidential process, and it's done behind the doors. Now, I wonder, how can we know? How can we be better informed? How can we access those mediator networks so we can at least have contact with the mediator and signal these important issues? So I just two points from me to finish. Thank you. Over.
Thanks, Kashka. So the first one is on the benefit and the necessity to have parliamentarians engaged and why we should be building up those relationships. And you're absolutely correct. We shouldn't be shying away from building up all sorts of relationships for the changes that we want to see. And the second part is understanding or being aware of the mediation that may be going on in a context. And again, that's something that I'd like to put in the ears of the future humanitarian coordinators who are going out there, who will have that capacity to sit between the peace building, the development and humanitarian side, and may be able to put those pieces together and support us as we go ahead with those kind of projects. So that's for sure. Walters, I'm going to give you the last comment of the day because we're over time. So over to you, sir.
Thank you. And very briefly, we're looking at risk, and often we look at risk coming from perhaps the government in terms of expulsion or refusal of access, or perhaps from armed groups when it comes to security. But I want to look at this other perspective where when international organizations don't do advocacy in a way that the community feels that they are being, their voices are being heard, they are being represented. We could also lose consent call it host country concern, not from the side of the government, but from the side of the people. So increasingly, you could see the crisis in peacekeeping now, where communities feel that peacekeeping missions are not doing their job in terms of representing them, their voices, and protecting them, that there is this pushback, sometimes even resulting to, violence and, stoning of peacekeeping trucks and things like that. So just to emphasize that, yeah, when you don't do advocacy, sometimes it's the people who themselves would want to turn against a mission or an organization. Over.
Correct. Thanks, Walters. That's an excellent point to finish on. The number one challenge for advocacy is not doing advocacy at all. And this seems to happen quite regularly. And the result is we are losing the trust of those kind of communities, and then the impact, the backlash is on ourselves. And it's always possible to do or say something. So thanks so much for that, Walter. I think that's a very important point. And as well, that aspect of bringing in the community at every level. And yeah, Kashka has one last question, I think, for a piece of work that she's doing. But for today's session, we are finished. Thank you very much. Please do your homework as always, and you'll get your feedback from Jose and myself. And as I recommended at the start, please, from each other, start to take a look. You will see the logic of these processes come through. And as I keep saying, the success of advocacy is in the system. No shortcuts, no quick route. Let's jump straight to the message. Do the analysis, do it again, do it again, do it again, build the organization or build the allies, build the coalition, go back and start it all over again and keep plugging away in the long term. That's essentially what we're trying to get across to everybody. Kashka, do you want to ask your question quite quickly, and then we're done? We will see everybody next week.
I've put it in the chat now, so colleagues have already seen it. So thanks very much.
Okay. Okay, great. Thanks, Kashka. Okay, so have a lovely week, everybody. If anyone has any questions, please stick around. We're here.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you. Thank you. Bye.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Stop recording. Stop.